My name is Dyer. I am a counseling student with Dallas Theological Seminary, and I am here today to present a church crisis plan to the different churches in Mason County. And with us here today, I have Pastor Tim Farenthold and his wife Claudia from Art Methodist Church. So thank you for being here today. And I'll also be sharing this presentation with other churches in the community. So my goal is to help churches know how to prepare and respond to a crisis situation. So when an emergency presents itself, let's define first of all what an emergency is. I'm going to read this definition, which I think explains it really well. So an emergency is an urgent, sudden, and serious event or an unforeseen change in circumstances that necessitates immediate action to remedy harm or avert imminent danger to life, health, or property, an exigency. So that's defining what an emergency is. When a crisis presents itself, it can cause a lot of trauma in a person, and it can cause a person to believe that his or her life or security is in danger, and it creates both a physical and an emotional reaction that leads to a distressed state. And notice that it can be a perception. So it's either actual or perception can cause this distressed state in a person. So how can we minimize impact? So my goal, my heart today is to help churches know that the more prepared you are, then the more you're going to minimize the impact that an emergency can have on an individual. If you're prepared for a fire and you have an exit plan and a response plan, then you're going to minimize impact to life and also the impact of trauma. If you think about you're getting the people out of the building as soon as possible, you're getting children with their parents quickly, you're saving lives. So that's, having a plan in place is helping to minimize the impact of that. So that's kind of that's my heart, and that's my reason for bringing that presentation today. If you think of an incident that may have come up in your church before where you weren't prepared, and just thinking about that, and if there was any chaos or undue trauma that was caused from that, this is why having a plan is really helpful. So part one is forming a collaborative crisis planning team. So that's the first step. So what does that look like? So you want to identify a core planning team. So depending on the size of your congregation and the different members that are attending, or you can also pull from people in the community. Some would be church leaders, first responders, medical professionals, mental health, anyone that's worked in crisis management, even like military would also be good to be on that team, security. So you want to identify a core team. You want it to be small, you don't want it to be too big. That way it's more cohesive and work well together. And that team, setting a purpose, vision, and goals for that team. So I listed a couple of ideas. So it might be, obviously you want to keep the church safe, reduce perceived, remember I've used that word again, perceived or actual danger at the church, providing training and providing emotional and mental support. Those are just some ideas, but that would be what your team would come up with. So the next step would be designating members of crisis response team and then defining the roles. So here are some suggestions for different team members' roles. A building coordinator would be someone that is very familiar with the building, having strategic exit plans in case of a tornado or a fire, where to store medical supplies, where AEDs would be kept. Those types of examples would be what a building coordinator would do. Incident coordinator, so this is the key person in the case of an emergency and a crisis response. This would be the key person to coordinate all the other team members and kind of putting things into action. Medical and mental health response team members. If you don't have any first responders or medical professionals, then find people that would like to get CPR qualified or to do any training in maybe mental health first aid. That would be learning how to sit with people in a crisis. And then you want a crisis response team members. So these would be people that actually put into action the exit plan, you know, getting those babies from that nursery outside, or setting up triage, that would be the medical, but setting up information center as a key place for people to come. Trying to think of some other examples for that crisis response team member. The lockdown shelter in place procedures, putting those into action. And then last of all, I'm going to talk about this towards the end, is a recovery team, because we know that emergencies don't just happen for one day and then crisis is over and done with. So that one is what I'll spend most of my time on. Okay, next step. And I just want to just share that I know this can be like a lot to do, to think, wow, there's a lot here. I'm going to have a lot of resources where they help you through like step by step. This is more of an overview that I'm sharing. So in a handout that I'll send to all the churches. So part 3 is identify possible threats and emergencies. So obviously tornado, where we live in Mason, you want to look at specific ones for our community or your church. So if you have a lot of elderlies, keeping that in mind. Obviously you wouldn't do a risk assessment for an earthquake. So there's just some ideas. You want to identify what those may be, and then the next step would be to determine goals and objectives for each one of those emergencies that you've identified. And you want to come up with goals. So goals, the desired outcome of a threat or emergency, and what personnel and other resources are supposed to achieve. And then obviously the objective is the action steps to achieve those goals. So I know that this is a lot, but it's just good to get the big picture. So thought we would take an example of a fire, of what those goals and objectives would look like. So you'd want to have 3 goals: preparing, preventing a fire, what you would do during a fire, and then after. And then for each of those goals, it's having an objective. So for example, preventing a fire would be storing combustible materials in fireproof containers, or making sure you have fire extinguishers and that they're kept up to date. And obviously during a fire that you evacuating all the people, and that you account for all the people that are there. And then after a fire, obviously you're notifying EMS, 911, and then beginning to provide medical and psychological first aid. So you would want to do one of these for each, like for a tornado, or if there was a medical emergency or a suicide, or some of those examples. So for each one of those, the next step is developing a response plan. So this is where you get more into the details. I won't talk about this too much because there's a lot here, but again, some of the resources in the Methodist Church may even have these already, or other denominations that give you more of a step-by-step. But pretty much it's the who, what, when, where, how. But the part I want to just emphasize is making sure that part of the response plan has how will this action, that last one, affect specific populations such as children, the elderly, individuals with disabilities, even with mental health disabilities, others with access and functional needs. So always keeping that in the forefront of your mind. Okay, having emergency contact information, always keeping that posted, and key places in the church, making sure that key members have that, keeping it up to date. And I've also formulated a emergency and crisis hotline resource list for the community and in the state as well that I'll share with you. So the last part that I want to spend the rest of my time talking about is going from response to recovery. So transitioning from responding to the crisis to recovering from a crisis. So this is like a timeline of needs. I really like this visual. So you want to think about the short term as you're looking at those immediate needs for food, clothing, shelter, communication. That's a key one, how to communicate. And then the longer term ones, this particular one is using a disaster as a example. So long term is the housing, replacing goods, finances, etc. And obviously a big one is the emotional support. So so it's transitioning in, and what does that look like? And the long-term goal is to return to a state of normalcy, which may be very different, but that's the long-term goal. So here's some long-term recovery goal ideas that team would work on. So the first one often gets overlooked is caring for crisis response team members and volunteers. They are working in that state of in a state of trauma where they're working where their adrenaline is kicked in, and that's kind of how our bodies are functioned and wired to kick in and to take action. And there's often not that time to process or to take care of themselves. So that's a key one to keep in mind for the team members and volunteers. And one idea with that is maybe checking in at the end of the day. Let's process how the day's gone. If there's local and state crisis relief organizations involved, then it's communicating, keeping the channels of communication open. Now, a key one is look for unmet needs in your congregation and community. So you want to look I'm going to get more into the emotional and the spiritual needs in a minute, but you want to look for the mental needs, especially those that have mental health problems already to start with, but now that that's been exacerbated, especially if there's a sense of there's trauma that they're working through. Physical needs is always a more tangible, easy one that we focus on. But the social needs, is there anyone that's isolated? Anyone that can't get around, that they need some social interaction? And then the spiritual needs, which I'll kind of touch on in a minute. Another one is ongoing communication. So in your preparing for an emergency, is you want to make sure that you have really good communication channels with your congregation, that's very much high on the priority, and that even when you're in the days, weeks and months after, is keep that communication ongoing, and with your congregation and the community. And so lastly is the emotional and spiritual care. So when talking to pastors and their wives, obviously you understand that and know that. But it's training the team members to what to look for. What does that look like? As people go through the grieving process, the pastoral support, the spiritual care, is understanding that people go through anger or questioning God, and understanding that that's a normal response to a crisis. So meeting those needs. Okay, and I lost my time. So the phases of disaster, it's very much a roller coaster of emotions. And why I wanted to highlight this was every person has been created by God uniquely, but God has created us in a way that there is a lot of similarities in how we respond to a crisis. And so this chart covers it really well. And it's so important to just the care and consideration is needed for each of these phases, and recognizing it and knowing that ahead of time. So the first phase, obviously you've got the rescue, and people are normally in that state of euphoria, where that adrenaline is kicking in, and they are like, go, go, go. And God's designed our bodies to do that for a short amount of time. And then going to the relief stage. That often is the honeymoon stage. That's where there's community cohesion. If you think everyone's going through the same thing and they're understanding what they're going through, they're supporting one another, and so that just develops a deep connectedness at the beginning. And then as the days go on and the weeks go on, when people start to look around, whatever the crisis may have been, they see the reality of that. Say if it was a suicide, it's the reality of we really miss that person, and it's needing to take that reality in and then to grieve that. Or if there is devastation from like a tornado, that stage is the disillusionment, is that despair and hopelessness and helplessness. And this is a really key part for when care is needed, to help people move towards being able to function just on their daily lives. And that can take weeks, months, and years. And you'll notice that there's those little dips, and they're called the triggers, the trigger events of the anniversary. And then moving towards, a new normal in their life. But definitely being aware, most pastors are, of the grief process, understanding that and what people are going through. So I thought this was a really good visual and really good to understand and know what people are experiencing when they go through a crisis, especially a disaster. So these are some resources that I'll be sharing also in the handout. And then I wanted to end with a scripture. The Israelites went through a period, years of crisis and trauma when they were exiled into Babylon or to Assyria. And I love how Isaiah wrote to encourage them through his words. And we have time, I'll just read it real quick. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of the vengeance of our God, and to comfort all who mourn, and provide for those who grieve in Zion, and to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. They will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They will renew the ruined cities that have been devastated for generations. God uses his people as the tangible presence of him to meet those needs when individuals go through a crisis or emergency. So thank you for your time. Thank you for coming today.